Hello everybody. This is the video companion to the Getting Started with R PDF. Now this is a guide that can be useful if you have already installed R and maybe this is your first time using R, so you want to figure out kind of how the program works, some of the basics of it before you start actually using it in class, or before you start doing a little bit more with it, such as importing data or downloading and installing packages, that kind of a thing. So like I said, there is a PDF for this. It's this one here. If you prefer reading to listening, you can just check out the PDF. It should have the same information for you. There's also one of these for RStudio, and there will be a video for that as well. But I would recommend looking at this one first, even if you plan on using RStudio, just because some of the basics that we're going to talk about here also apply when you're using R within RStudio. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing I'm going to talk about is just the R interface, kind of the basic thing you're going to see when you open R. So I have a desktop icon here for R. So if I click that, R is going to open up and it's going to look something like this. So this is what you'll see. I am on a PC, so if you're on a Mac, you might see something a little bit different, but this is generally the thing you'll see. And the two main important things for us at the start here are, of course, the R console, which is kind of a little window within this bigger program, and this menu up at the top. So we've got the menu and we've got the console. So the menu options, as we'll see in a second, can be helpful to create scripts, change your directory, which you would do if you were installing packages, and adjust the interface for R. The console is where you're going to be doing your actual R coding. So if you notice, there is some text in here right now, but you'll see in a second that you can actually type in here, and we'll talk about that. So this text that comes up when you first open R is kind of just some basic information about the version of R that you have. This can be useful if you need to install packages or update R later. More information on that will be described later. But it's basically just telling you a little bit about R. If you want to clear this text, or anytime when you're doing code, if you have too much stuff in your window and you want to just clear it out and make it nice and clean, you can either right-click and select Clear Window, or as you can see here, at least on a PC, you can press Control and L, and that will clear out the window as well. So I'm just going to do that. Control L at the same time will clear out my console. Now, one other thing you might want to do once you're getting started, especially if you're somebody who might have a visual impairment, or maybe small text is hard for you to see, or you don't like the colors that R uses, is to change the colors or the size of the text in the console. So this is something that I do when I'm making R videos. You might have noticed if you were following along, your text might look a lot smaller than mine did on the screen. And that's because I changed my GUI preferences. So if you want to change the text preference here, actually let me X out of here and reopen R. So this is what R looks like by default. So notice that's a lot smaller text than what I had before. So let's say I wanted to change this back to what I had, a bigger text. So the way that you can change your preference is you can go to Edit, and then GUI Preferences here, and that will open a pop-up window. That's going to pop up on my other monitor, but it should pop up right in front of you. And here you can change a lot of the features of the interface for R. So you can change the font itself, you can change its size, its style, you can even change the background and the text color. There's some other options here, but those are probably the main ones, are the text and maybe the color if you need a different color combination. So I keep the same font, but I had this set to a size of 14 and bold. And you can see there's a preview, and when I click OK, that's what it looked like before. Now I'll clear this here and again in a second, but the thing I want to talk about first before we really get into doing a lot of stuff with R is the R prompt. And what I mean by the R prompt is this little line here. So this is the place where you can start typing your command or your code. So notice that it's got a little cursor here, this bar, and a little sideways caret. And this is just where you can type. So typically you'll be maybe using R as a calculator, or you'll have certain functions that you'll need for class to run in R. This is where you run them. And just as a quick example here, the way that you run code, so say I wanted to use R as a calculator and I wanted to divide 9 by, I don't know, 44. I type that in there and then I hit enter. And when I hit enter, R does the calculation for me. If I'm running a function, so say I wanted to run the mean function or some other function, I could type the function and then hit enter, and R will run the function for me. So as we'll see in a second, there's a lot of things we can do in R. For the calculator mode, we can use R for a bunch of different functions, but to code or to input things into R to have it calculate for us, you just type at this line and then hit enter. Now, sometimes what happens, let me just go ahead and clear that. Sometimes what happens is you might make a mistype and you might not complete your command. So say again, I wanted to divide 9 by 44, but I accidentally hit enter before I enter the 44. R is going to recognize this thing as a division operator, and it's going to say 9 divided by what? And it's asking me here with this little plus sign to finish the command, to finish the code so that R can do its thing. So I just accidentally pressed enter. I'm like, oh no, I forgot to put the 44. So I can just put the remaining part of the code here in that plus sign line and then hit enter again. And you'll see that R does my output for me there. Probably the most common time you'll see this is if you're doing an expression that has multiple parentheses in it. So just again as an example here, let me do, 4 minus 7 divided by 3 times 1.2. And notice I'm forgetting a close parentheses here, so I don't have a matching close parentheses for that. So if I hit enter, R is going to be like, hey, finish your code. So if I go ahead and type in another parentheses, just a close parentheses, I don't have to type the whole thing again. It will be like, oh, okay, close parentheses, code is complete, here's the answer. Another thing you can do, so if you want to go back to a previous line of code, you can hit the up arrow on your keyboard. So there I'm just going back to the last thing I entered. There's the next to last line, etc. I have some stuff in here from before. But if you want to just go back to the last line that you entered and do something else to it, so maybe I want to do something like that, you can edit the code that way as well. There's a lot easier way to deal with code, which is the R script. I'll talk about that in a second. But if you're just using R as a calculator, typically you'll just be typing it in the console like this. And another thing, let me go back to that line where I missed the parenthesis. If I am in one of these pluses and I want to get out of that, so maybe I don't even want to bother correcting this, I'm like, okay, just take me out of the calculation. Don't ask me for anything else. I can hit escape. And notice that now I have my prompt again. This thing here is something where I can type a brand new line if I want to. And if I just keep hitting enter, it's just going to give me more prompts. Enter doesn't do anything on its own when you don't have any code. So that's kind of the basics as far as how the code runs in R. Now, another thing I want to mention here before we actually get started doing some things is I want to mention actually two things. I want to mention how to get some help with code, and I want to just talk about what you'll see when you close R, and then we'll do some more stuff with it here. So beyond just using R as a calculator, what you're going to be seeing it for in a lot of courses is you're going to be seeing the use of functions. So for example, in Stat 213, we're going to be dealing with probability distributions, like the binomial distribution, the Poisson distribution. In Stat 321, same thing, but with a couple extra distributions as well. So we'll be seeing code like p-binom, and then that you enter some stuff in there, or q-norm, and you'll enter some stuff in there. So these things, some more simple ones, are like the mean function, to calculate the mean of some numbers that you put in the parentheses, the median function, those kind of things. So these are all functions that are built into R to do specific calculations. If you are using a function that you're not familiar with, or you're using a function that takes a lot of input, one thing that you can do is you can get a little bit of extra help. R has documentation for all of the functions that are in the program. So for example, let's say I want to use the p-binom function, but maybe I forgot what is supposed to go in these parentheses, or I forgot what the p-binom function does. What I can do if I want a little bit of R's own documentation on that is I can type a question mark and then the name of the function without the parentheses. So question mark p-binom. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to open an online help resource. So this is R's kind of online little help center. It's just called R documentation. And what this does, let me zoom in here a little bit, is it tells me a little bit about, in this case, this family of functions. So p-binom is actually one of several functions that we can use when we're dealing with the binomial distribution, which depending on the course you're taking, you'll learn about that later. But this is a good place to check just by typing the question mark in front of the function name in case you aren't sure how a function works or what a function does. So this tells you what the function does. It tells you the things that the function takes, and then it gives you some information about those things. So the arguments that the function takes, it tells you what those are in the context of whatever that topic is or whatever that calculation is. It also has some examples. So sometimes these pages are longer than others, depends on the function. For example, if I look up the mean function, this just calculates the arithmetic mean. Not too complicated of a function. Notice this is pretty short. It only just takes some numbers. Nothing too fancy. But this can be useful if you feel like you need a little bit more help with a function. All right, so the last thing we're going to do here before we get into just some basic uses of R as a calculator and then a little bit more about scripts is I just want to talk about what you'll see when you close R. So if I want to get out of R, rather than clicking on this button here, this X, I'm going to click on this X on the outer part. So on the part that says R GUI, I'm going to click X. And you'll see this pop up here. It says save workspace image, yes or no, or cancel if you just want to go back in. For most purposes, you're not going to want to worry about saving the workspace image. In most cases, if you have code that you want to save and use later, you'll save it as an R script, which again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I typically click no here. There's usually nothing in here worth saving that I haven't put in an R script. So if I'm just using R as a calculator or I don't care about saving the code that I've typed in, clicking no is fine, and all that does is it just closes R. So that's kind of the very basic operation of R. Now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about using R as a calculator and some other basic functions that R uses. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail here. This is again just kind of an intro, getting started with R guide. And so a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about here is just the basics. Depending on the class you're taking, you will be seeing more functions, more detail for those functions. This is just kind of the bare bones. This is what you need to really get into R so that you can learn about other stuff later. So you can learn about like the p-binom function or the mean function, those kinds of things. Let me clear my console. All right, so now just going to go back in PDF. I am here on page 8 just talking about using R as a calculator. So we kind of demonstrated some of this a second ago, so I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but I did put a list in here of some of the more basic calculator functions and what those symbols are in R. So add, subtract, multiply, divide, kind of the symbols you would think they would be. If you want to raise something to an exponent, you use the caret. So for example, 10 caret 2 is 10 squared. You can also do exponents that are fractions. So if I wanted to take the square root of 100, I could either do 100 raised to the 1/2. Oops. There we go. Sorry, I had to put brackets around that. Okay, that's actually something worth noting. So good mistake. So what I did here, let me go back to that first line, is I did 100 caret 1/2. Notice I got 50, which is not the square root of 100. Why did I get 50? Because in R, it read this as the first operation it should perform. So 100 raised to the 1, which is just 100. And then it did the division. So it took 100 divided by 2. That's why I got 50. If I put parentheses around the 1/2, then R is going to calculate that as 100 raised to the 1/2. And it's going to do the correct calculation. So that actually is a good mistake to make that I just did, because that emphasizes the importance of parentheses in R. It does have an order of operations order built into it, but if you want to make sure you're getting everything in the right order and doing the exact calculation you want, parentheses are your friend. So for example, if I wanted to do the cube root of 100, if I did this, it would just take 100 divided by 3. So I would have to do 100 raised to the, in parentheses, 1/3 to get the cube root of 100. So just as an example. And where I was going with this originally, I could do 100 raised to the 1/2 to take the square root. There is actually also a square root function. There isn't one of these for like the cube root or the 5th root or anything like that, but you can always just raise the number to a fraction to get those nth roots. One that is a little bit confusing is e. So the number e, Euler's number, that 2.718, etc., that isn't e. E is not a built-in value in R, but exp is. So that exp, this is the value for the number 2.718, so Euler's number. So if I want Euler's number, I just take e raised to the 1, which gives me Euler's number. So that's the one that's kind of weird. Pi is just pi. There's a couple other built-in numbers, but those are probably the main ones that you'll see. So just some basic calculator information. Like I said, there's a couple more in here for reference. There's some other basic functions as well that can be useful when we're doing just kind of some basic stuff in R. So in a lot of your classes, you will go beyond just using R as a calculator, but sometimes there are some more quote-unquote basic functions that you will continue to use even when you start getting to a higher level of R. Now, I do want to emphasize again that this is just kind of a basic introduction to R. These operations that I'm mentioning here are just some of the operations that exist, or some of the other functions that exist. These are, like I said, just some of the basic ones that you might run into in a course that you're taking, whether it's an intro stats course or even like a 300 level stats course. Oops. So some of the common ones that are useful are the sequence function, which is just a colon. This is useful for creating a sequence of integers. So for example, if I wanted to just list the integers 1 through, let's say 16, I would just type in 1 colon 16. Negative 3 colon 8 will give me all of the integers from negative 3 to 8, that kind of thing. Now, this on its own doesn't really do a lot, but one thing that you can do is you can actually make vectors of numbers. And that's by combining, if you want to, the sequence function with the concatenate function. So the concatenate function is just a c, a lowercase c, and it takes whatever numbers you plug into it and makes that into a vector. So here I'm making a vector of the numbers 2, 4, 6, 8. I could make a vector of the numbers negative 3, or the integers from, let's do 4 to 13. Now it kind of displays it the same way, but as we'll see, this concatenate function can be used for non-sequence values. So if I wanted to do something like this, I would use the concatenate function, then if I hit enter, it makes a vector out of those numbers. Another function that can be useful in conjunction with either just the C function or the sequence function is the sum function. So we have plus to add 2 or more numbers, so I could do like 9 plus 5 plus 8, etc. But if I have a bunch of numbers that I want to sum, or I have numbers in a vector that I want to sum, I can use the sum function. And it just takes the numbers I feed it and adds it up. Now another thing that's nice about the sum function is you can kind of use it like the concatenate function in the sense that you can give it numbers that are not sequential. So if I wanted to sum negative 5, 4.5, 8, and 100, it will just give me the sum. So here are just a couple of those other basic functions that are really useful in R. Clear my console. All right. Now, the next really important thing as you start working more and more with R is the fact that you can actually assign names to certain values or calculations. So just like in a regular math class, sometimes you might have a quantity that you want to represent as a variable, or you want to give it a name. So for example, maybe you have a certain number that you want to call x, or a certain quantity you want to call quantity, or something like that. There are 2 functions that work as assigning functions in R, meaning that if I type a word or a letter or some naming phrase and then use this function, anytime I type that number or that value, it will give me the thing I assigned it to. So for example, let's just use that first one. This first assigning function is a less than sign and then a dash. Let's say x is 3. So anytime I type x, so here I'm just typing x again, it's going to give me 3. And I can do calculations with this. Let me just do another one here. Let's say y. I could use this as an assigning function. I could use this as an assigning function. Y is 24. I can do x plus y. I can do x divided by y. I could do the sum of x and y. I can do things with those variables. It's basically just like variables in math. You can assign names to more than just single values as well. So if I wanted to assign a name to a calculation, I'll call it h. H is 55 plus 6 divided or times, let's raise it to a power. Let's have fun. Raised to the 2. So what is h? H is that. And again, I can use h in calculations if I want to. So that's a really big number. So that's one thing you can do with assigning names. As far as naming conventions go, R is kind of picky about it. It's not too bad. There are coding environments that are a little bit worse than R with what it takes to make a valid name. You can use letters, whether uppercase or lowercase. Note that it treats lowercase and uppercase as distinct. So here x equals 5, here capital X equals 6. They are different things. You can also give it a text name. So I could say big number is 4,000. Small number is 0.08. And then again, I can do things with that. You can also put numbers in your names. You just can't name a thing just a number, or you can't put a number at the front. So if I wanted to say variable 4, something like that, that works. I can also use periods and underscores. I just can't start a name with a period or an underscore. That kind of thing. It also doesn't like spaces in names, so periods and underscores can be kind of used in place of spaces, because if I try to say like my variable equals 3, it's going to be like, I don't know what the heck that is. This space is throwing R off. But if I went up here and said, oops, I forgot you can't use spaces, let me use a period, then it's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. Just some conventions. All right, now another quick thing here. I'll just use the PDF for this. Sometimes when you're doing calculations, especially when you get into things like probability, you might end up with, I guess not always probability, but you might end up with very large or very small numbers. And R has a specific way of displaying numbers that are quite large and quite small. So here I have the example 45 raised to the 9th and 45 raised to the negative 9th. Notice there's a funky little thing going on here. Let me just type that in here. So I have a number, but then I have this e plus 14, which is kind of weird looking. So what is this actually read as? Well, this is what's called E notation. And E notation is basically another way of writing scientific notation, where the E, this part, stands for 10 to the power of. So basically what's going on here is we have this thing times 10 to the power of positive 14. So like I have written here. So really, really big number, lots and lots and lots of zeros. And it's the same thing if we have a very small number. So 45 raised to the negative 9 is going to be very, very small. This is 1.321561 times 10 to the negative 15. So a very, very small number. So if you see that notation, it's kind of weird, it's kind of unusual. Just think of it as scientific notation, where this is read as like 10, or read as times 10 raised to the this. Or in general, plus something after the E is very, very big, minus something after the E is very, very small. Alrighty, I'm going to move this back over here just so we have a little bit more space. So once you get beyond using R as a calculator, what you might want to do is you might want to start saving your code. So once you start using functions like the main function or the pbinom function or the qnorm function, you might want to save your chunks of code somewhere where you can go back and use them again or edit them later or just refer to them later. So the easiest way to do that is to use what's called an R script. So if I just type into the R console, unless I like select it all and copy and paste it into like a Word document or a text file, it's not so easy to save. But R has kind of a built-in editor that allows you to work on your code outside of the R console and then send it to the R console to be run, to be calculated once you're ready for it. And that's called an R script. So if you want to create an R script, you're going to go up to File, New Script, and notice that that just opens another window in our little GUI window here. This is basically like a text file. So if you're on a PC and you know the Notepad application, this is basically like Notepad built into R. I can type in here, I can hit enter, I can do whatever. And notice it's not doing anything to my R console. It's just basically like a little text editor. So what I can do in here is I can make whatever code I want. Let me make it look a little prettier than that. Let me just make a couple quick things here. So here I'm just doing some code. Nothing's going on here. But let's say I wanted to run one of these lines. Maybe I want to do some sort of calculation. Or any of these lines. Let me just run the first one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my cursor in that line and then either right-click and select Run Line or Selection. Or, as you can see here on a PC, I can click or press Control-R. And what this is going to do is it's going to send that line to my R console. It's going to run it for me, and then it's going to give me my next blank line, indicating that it has already run this line. So I should have V defined as 3 plus 5, and I do. Here, if I run the vector, I should have this vector defined, which I do. If I want to run this whole block of code, or whatever block of code, select it all, right-click, and it'll run the whole thing. And here it's just doing that calculation because I didn't assign it a name. It just does the calculation itself. So this is really convenient because now what you have is you have something that is basically just a text file. And you can save this and open it again if you want to. So let's say I'm done, maybe for the day, maybe I'm going home, maybe I'm done dealing with R for the day, and I want to save this code. So I go to File, Save As. Okay, first I'm going to make sure this window is active. So notice this is kind of highlighted as opposed to my console. Make sure this window is active. File, Save As. And then I'm just going to save this wherever I want to put my file. So it saves it as a .r file, so it's an R file, but it will open with R or RStudio. It recognizes that file type. So if I already called one of these example scripts. Let me just call it this. I'm just saving this to my desktop, save it, and it saves wherever the heck it is on my desktop. And if I want to, so let's say I close it. If I want to open that, I can go to File, Open Script, and then I can just select that particular file. Now, you will probably see the R icon here, so that blue R, you'll probably see that as the indicator for this file type. I have a different R editor on my PC, so it's showing a weird symbol, but it is the script that we just made. Ignore this symbol for it. But if I double click that, it just opens it back up from where I had saved it. Now, one other thing that's really nice, especially when you're dealing with scripts, is in addition to saving the code, you can also type comments to yourself in the code. So if you want to comment what the code does or what the code is being used for, or maybe something about a reference to a part of your notes, you can do that in your script. And the way that you make a comment is you start the comment with a hashtag, and then you can type whatever you want. And this will not run in R. So even if I select this whole thing, it will show up, but it's just a comment, so it doesn't have a consequence. It's just like, this is some note to yourself. It doesn't really run. It's just there. So it's just a comment to yourself. And you can make these in line as well. So maybe I like, this was from page 4 or 3 in the note package 4.5 or something like that. So I can type that in line with the calculation, and it will do the calculation as long as that hashtag is after the calculation, and it will keep that comment there. So commenting is really nice because then you can help yourself out in the future when you're going back and looking at this code, maybe before an exam or something, and you're like, oh my God, I forgot what this code is even referring to, or maybe you forgot what chapter you were working on. Comments are a really good thing to do in code because they will help you basically decode your code later. You'll know what you were doing when you wrote it, because I know there's been a bunch of times where I've made a bunch of code for something and I thought to myself, I'm going to know what this is for later. And then I open it up a week later, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even remember what this was for. What are all these values? So commenting is a good way to kind of get around that possible issue. All right, so that's the real basics of R. The console itself, how to enter code, how to use R as a basic calculator, and how to open, use, and save scripts, including comments in your scripts. So this is stuff that will help you once you start using R in whatever class you're taking. In 213, we're going to start using R in Unit 2, so there's a couple weeks before we actually start using R in class. If you're in Stat 321, for example, the same sort of a thing. There's going to be a few weeks before we get to code. But in other classes, you might be using code almost right away, maybe in Stat 217. So it's a good idea to just get the basics kind of figured out at first, so that once you start actually using R as you're going to be using it in your class, it's going to be a little bit easier for you.